At one point, he was among the most decorated and revered Ukrainian officers, the commander of Ukraine's 36th Brigade, a soldier who guarded Crimea with his life and commanded his troops with respect. But then Russia annexed Crimea, and the officer betrayed Ukraine. Now that very officer is leading one of Russia's most damaging offensives. Only the damage is being done to his own forces. The irony is brutal as Ukraine's traitor now commands Russia's greatest failures. That man is Lieutenant General Serhiy Storozhenko, and his story is one of betrayal, failure, and humiliation. As a decorated officer, Storozhenko was supposed to be a man upon whom Ukraine could rely to protect Crimea when Vladimir Putin attempted to annex the peninsula. He commanded the 36th Brigade, which was the largest land component of the Ukrainian Navy at the time. So he had more than enough men following his lead to put up a fight against Russia. At the very least, Storozhenko could have held his ground until aid or orders came from Ukraine's high command. But the lieutenant general didn't do that. Instead, he gave the order to surrender. That order came on May 2, 2014, the virtual Museum of Russian Aggression wrote in 2022. It was on this day that Storozhenko and his brigade's military town were surrounded by Russia's invading forces. Storozhenko didn't even consider fighting. There was no order to confront the enemy or hold ground. Storozhenko simply told his soldiers to lay down their arms and surrender the entire brigade to the Russians, betraying the brigade's oath in the process. That oath was to protect Ukraine's sovereignty. Storozhenko handed Crimea over on a silver platter. Those who might want to be kind to Storozhenko could claim that he made this decision to protect his soldiers. They were outnumbered and outgunned. So surrender may have been the most prudent decision. It wasn't, and some of Storozhenko's soldiers knew it. The museum claims that a few of the soldiers once under Storozhenko's command disobeyed his orders and followed the commander of the Mountain Infantry Battalion, Yuri Holovashenko. Under Holovashenko's command, those soldiers created a circular defense and prepared to do battle against Russia. Unfortunately, it was all for naught. Most of Storozhenko's forces stayed with him in the newly occupied peninsula, with only those who had left his command in anger returning to the Ukrainian mainland so they could continue to uphold their military oath to their country. In the aftermath of the debacle, Storozhenko tried to save face. Those who'd witnessed him give his order recalled that he not only told his soldiers to surrender their weapons, but to also side with the Russian occupiers that would otherwise have tried to kill them. Storozhenko tried to claim that wasn't the case. RFU News says he'd merely resigned from his post and he'd made no attempt to join up with the Russian forces. It wouldn't take long for that story to be proven as a lie. With the occupation of Crimea complete, Russia held a phony referendum on the peninsula, RFU News says. According to RFU News, a week after the results of that referendum came in, Storozhenko received a Russian passport. This must have been his place from the start. By handing over Crimea, by surrendering the Ukrainian Navy's largest land force, the traitor got in good with Russia. He became a Russian citizen. Not only that, but he earned himself a new career. Very soon after the annexation of Crimea, Storozhenko found himself at the head of a brand new brigade, a Russian brigade. The betrayal was complete, and with his awarding of a new role so soon after his order to lay down arms, Storozhenko proved to his former country that this was his plan all along. Storozhenko wasn't a man who'd found himself facing a threat against which he couldn't contend. He wasn't a coward. That could be understood, if not necessarily forgiven. Storozhenko was an opportunist, one who had seen a way to ingratiate himself with the Russian invaders, even if it meant surrendering his honor and an entire peninsula that had been placed under his protection. Storozhenko's betrayal had a massive impact on Ukraine. iNews has even more details. The traitor was a graduate of Ukraine's Kyiv Army Academy, where he received his education in the reconnaissance department. By iNews' account, he was an exceptional student who displayed extraordinary military prowess, which is what led to his rising to such a prominent position in Crimea in the first place. Storozhenko's betrayal damaged Ukrainian morale at the time, but a lot worse was to come. In the period between the annexation of Crimea and the launch of Putin's Ukraine invasion, Storozhenko spent his time quietly moving up the Russian military's ranks. He was more than happy to do what his new country told him to do, and by the time 2022 came around, Storozhenko was the chief of staff of the 35th Army of Russia's Eastern Military District. The traitor hadn't just disappeared into the Russian military hierarchy, he was leading a group of soldiers who would, from the very beginning, be taking part in Putin's invasion. Storozhenko was supposed to be dangerous. A man who knew Ukraine better than almost anybody else in Russia's military, and somebody with the tactical nous and skill to cause serious damage. Only that's not how it's gone for the Ukrainian traitor. Time and time again, he has failed in everything that Russia has asked him to do. Storozhenko's first major failure came in the Kharkiv region. As part of the 35th Army, Storozhenko led the initial invasion into that region, and for a time, he experienced some success. At least it was a success in the sense that his troops did what Putin wanted, brutalized Kharkiv while killing civilians and razing portions of the region to the ground. However, it was in this initial assault that the cracks started to show. Much like Putin himself, Storozhenko had never expected Ukraine to fight back so fiercely. Perhaps he had fooled himself into thinking that the soldiers he was sent to fight would be just as willing to turn their backs on their country as he was. Storozhenko was wrong. Under Storozhenko, Russia managed to establish a main bastion in the settlement of Izium. From here, Russia's forces were supposed to advance deeper into Kharkiv, eventually taking the entire region. But far from using Izium as a launch pad for further victories, Storozhenko and his soldiers found themselves desperately defending the bastion. It was meant to be their stronghold. It wouldn't be long before Russia's forces crumbled. On September 10, 2022, Russia abandoned Izium altogether as Storozhenko's forces collapsed in the face of a rapid Ukrainian advance. Al Jazeera labeled the incident as the worst defeat Russia has experienced since it was pushed back from the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv during the early weeks of the invasion. Reporting from the scene, Al Jazeera's Gabriel Elizondo revealed that Izium had been a key military stronghold for Russia inside Ukraine, especially due to its role as a logistical hub, serving Russian forces elsewhere in the country. Russia had fought long and hard to establish that stronghold, only to have all of that hard work undone in a matter of days. It took the Russians 6 weeks of fighting to get a hold of that city, and now it appears that the Ukrainians will have retaken it in pretty much a 12 to 24-hour time frame, Elizondo told Al Jazeera. Storozhenko may have just proven himself not to have the brilliant military mind so many in Ukraine believed him to have. Still, his 35th Army left behind a trail of devastation in its former stronghold. Even before Storozhenko's forces were pushed out of Izium, there was evidence that the traitor was doing more than just fighting against Ukraine's army. He was ordering his soldiers to kill civilians with no mercy. In May 2022, the BBC reported that the bodies of at least 44 Ukrainian civilians had been found under the rubble of Izium. All had been victims of a 5-story residential building collapsing under the force of Russia's shelling, showcasing how little regard Storozhenko had for his former country people. By September 2022, when Storozhenko's forces were finally pushed out of Izium, The Guardian was reporting that the city may have become another Bucha. For those who don't know, Bucha represents the site of Russia's most terrible war crimes against Ukraine. Russia engaged in the mass murder of civilians and prisoners of war in Bucha, the extent of which still isn't fully known. By August 2022, the bodies of at least 458 Ukrainian civilians had been recovered in Bucha, 419 of whom were confirmed to have died as a result of some form of military action. 12 of the dead were children. Most had been shot in close range with signs of torture in a style resembling a mob hit or execution. Izium was similarly devastated by Storozhenko and Russia's 35th Army. Most of Izium has been destroyed. The main boulevard is full of gutted apartment blocks and walls pockmarked by bullets. The administration building is an eerie, sandbagged ruin. A bomb tore a chunk out of a church's cupola. The city's road bridge has been destroyed, with residents getting around on bikes, The Guardian reported in September 2022. Storozhenko had showcased his brutality, but Ukraine had highlighted the traitor's failings. The former Crimean commander had utterly failed to hold the stronghold he'd spent months trying to capture. Thanks to Storozhenko's failure, combined with Ukraine's brilliant counterattack, Russia's Kharkiv ambitions were set back to the point where Putin's forces are still trying to capture the region over 3 years later. For any other military, this abject failure on Storozhenko's part would have been enough to strip him of his command. He was responsible for making the invasion a whole lot harder for Russia going forward, and yet that's not what Putin did. Far from being punished for his failure, Storozhenko was rewarded. In 2023, Storozhenko was promoted under an order signed directly by Putin to become the commander of Russia's 6th Army. After throwing away the lives of soldiers and civilians alike in Izium, Storozhenko was going to be given the command of another group that would be responsible for storming the Ukrainian city of Kupiansk. That second city would become the site of an even greater failure for the traitor than Izium, but we'll come back to that in a moment. First, questions have to be asked about how Putin decided that a man who had failed so dramatically should be given another chance, and not just any chance, an opportunity to lead another of Russia's most important charges against Ukraine. It can't have been because Storozhenko was a stellar commander. He'd betrayed Ukraine in Crimea and failed in Kharkiv. Perhaps Putin was impressed by the former Ukrainian officer's brutality. Storozhenko had overseen the deaths of many in Izium, showing no compassion for his former country people. That may be the sort of quality Putin admired. Or perhaps Russia's president thought that the sacrifice of having such an incompetent commander was worth it, for the simple fact that he could parade Storozhenko as a commander who'd realized the error of his ways, a turncoat who was fighting for Russia because he believed that Russia should control Ukraine. Whatever the case may be, Storozhenko was promoted to the rank of lieutenant general and went to oversee Russia's forces in Kupiansk. It's unknown precisely when Storozhenko was sent to Kupiansk, though it's possible he may have been operating in the region since 2023. But by September 19th, Ukraine knew for sure that their traitorous commander was heading the forces attempting to invade the vital city. Liga reports that the Dnipro Operational and Strategic Group of Troops spokesperson Nazar Voloshin has confirmed that Russia has created a Kharkiv group of troops that is currently assaulting Kupiansk. That group includes the 6th Combined Arms Army, which Storozhenko now commands. It's in Kupiansk that Storozhenko is in the midst of yet another failure. RFU News has the details, which it published on October 1st in a report where it dubs Russia's Kupiansk offensive a disaster that has led to 22 months of slaughter. The offensive has turned into one of Russia's greatest disasters of the Ukraine war so far, as Storozhenko leads a grinding campaign that sees entire brigades being fed into the meat grinder for practically no gains. The Russian failures in Kupiansk started late in 2022. Much like Izium, Kupiansk had been subjected to Russian occupation during the initial months of the invasion, only for Ukraine to launch a counterattack that pushed the Russians out of the city. Russian armies have hurled themselves against Ukrainian defenses on several axes near Kupiansk, RFU News reports. But each of these has become a graveyard for Russian troops. There are many examples of these failures under Storozhenko, the outlet says. Take Sinkiivka. There, Russia attempted to launch an assault using armored columns with the intention of breaking through into the settlement. Ukraine's response was to counter, predominantly using artillery fire, to leave most of the armored column ruined in the forest belt surrounding the settlement. Dead Russians and destroyed vehicles now litter that forest belt, and Russia can't pick itself back up. Ukraine's special forces operatives are active around Sinkiivka, where they conduct regular raids to keep Russia's forces pinned down and unable to launch proper assaults. That's happening thanks to Storozhenko's failures. Under the Ukrainian traitor's guidance, Russia's soldiers are doing no better in the southern region of Pishchany. There, Storozhenko came up with a strategy that, if it had worked, it would have split Ukraine's forces in two. With the forces separated, Russia could have then used its manpower advantage to attack two smaller contingents of Ukrainian troops. But like everything else that Storozhenko does, the strategy failed. All that Storozhenko managed to do was create a funnel into which he now pours Russian soldiers. Far from splitting Ukraine's forces in two, that funnel is practically encircled and being attacked from all sides. It's a kill zone, one into which Ukraine sends first-person view drones and artillery rounds to decimate the Russian troops. Any attempt Russia makes to widen the corridor that Storozhenko asked them to create is met with Ukrainian firepower. Russia's forces are exhausted and undersupplied due to being cut off from logistical support once they enter the corridor, making them easy prey for Ukraine's defenders. Who would have guessed that sending troops directly into the middle of a massive Ukrainian defense would have resulted in those troops being cut off and surrounded? Storozhenko didn't guess, at least. And now yet more Russians are dying under his command in Kupiansk. Storozhenko has at least experienced one success in his Kupiansk assignment. He's managed to take the settlement of Dovorichna, which lies north of Kupiansk and is within the Russian bridgehead, RFU News reports. Granted, it took months of assaults against that settlement that cost yet more hundreds of Russian soldiers, and we'll get to the true numbers soon, but Russia has at least claimed that one settlement. But before Storozhenko can hang his hat on this particular achievement, RFU News says, the prize he's managed to gain is practically useless to Russia. You would assume that Dovorichna was a target because it could provide a route into Kupiansk. That must have been what Storozhenko thought, else he wouldn't have dedicated so much time and blood to capturing the settlement. However, Ukraine was prepared for that capture, and it surrounded the routes out of Dovorichna with so much firepower that Russia's soldiers can't advance from the settlement and across the Oskil River to continue an assault in the direction of Kupiansk. There is no prospect of operational success from Dovorichna. So Storozhenko is doing what has been done in the Kupiansk region for 22 months, feeding soldiers into the meat grinder. The bridgehead is static, with Russia's soldiers being cut down by Ukraine's defenses whenever they attempt to advance. The supposedly brilliant military mind of the man who betrayed Ukraine has been able to achieve nothing but lock his forces into a stalemate from which there is no escape. Russia's Kupiansk forces are dying in droves. Storozhenko is the reason why. That brings us to the death count. During 22 months of fighting, Russia has managed to expand the majority of two of its combined arms armies, including the 6th Army that Storozhenko now leads. Russia's casualties in Kupiansk during that 22-month period amount to 13,000 troops, which amounts to about 590 dead, injured, or captured soldiers per month. Bear in mind that Kupiansk is far from a vitally strategic city in the same way as Pokrovsk, Zaporizhia, or Donetsk. Kupiansk itself only has a pre-war population of about 26,600 people, meaning Russia has spent around half of the city's population on making no progress. Storozhenko's failure is complete. The Ukrainian traitor has become one of Russia's greatest embarrassments. Putin is trying to save face, of course. On October 2nd, RBC Ukraine reported that Putin is claiming that Russia's forces have made advances in Kupiansk. The Western grouping of forces has practically taken one of the large settlements, 2/3 of Kupiansk. The city center is already in our hands, while fighting continues in the southern part of the city, Putin claimed in a speech delivered at the Valdai Forum. But the advance is going nowhere near as well as Russia's president claims. Either Putin doesn't know how poorly Storozhenko is actually doing in Kupiansk, or he does, and he's trying to hide the reality. Either way, it's clear that Putin has a dud commander on his hands. The man who betrayed Ukraine and was supposed to offer Russia knowledge of the country that could come from nobody else has only managed to fail in everything that he's been asked to do. In 2014, when Storozhenko first betrayed his countrymen with his order to lay down arms in Crimea, Ukraine was stung by a betrayal that it never saw coming. When Storozhenko started rising through the ranks of Russia's army, Ukraine rightly feared what his knowledge of Ukraine's military and supposed acumen would bring to the table. Now, Storozhenko is the subject of jokes. Casualties have skyrocketed so much since the start of the Kupiansk offensive that some Russian analysts whisper about deliberate sabotage, RFU News says. Ukraine's soldiers know that isn't the case. To them, Storozhenko has devolved from a legitimate threat into an almost accidental spy, a man whose blundering incompetence is such that he's doing more damage to Russia from within than he would have ever been able to do to the country if he'd stuck with Ukraine. That is the ultimate irony. Perhaps it's time that Ukraine starts delivering more of its traitors to Russia. If those traitors experience the same sort of failures as Storozhenko, the Ukraine war might be over in a matter of months. Throughout September, Russia has been secretly attacking NATO. Russia would never admit it, of course, but there's no other way to describe Russia's decision to send drones and fighter jets into NATO territory several times during the course of the month. Russia hasn't declared outright war, but it's pushing boundaries and testing responses to see what NATO will do. Now, the true reason why Russia is secretly attacking NATO has finally been revealed, and that reason has come straight out of Vladimir Putin's mouth. On October 2nd, Censor.net reported on a speech that Putin gave at the Valdai Discussion Club in Russia. That club, which is named after Lake Valdai, was founded in 2004 and is essentially Russia's version of a think tank, much like RUSI or CSIS. Only, as you can probably guess, Valdai's opinions tend to amount to everything that Russia does is right and everything that the West does is wrong. Speakers and attendees include Putin himself, along with Kremlin cronies such as Dmitry Medvedev and Russia's former Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu. If unbiased thinking is what you want, Valdai isn't the club for you. It's essentially a mechanism through which the Kremlin can spread its propaganda. That's precisely what Putin did during his October speech, and in the process, he gave some twisted reasons for why Russia has started a secret war against NATO. To Putin, it all comes down to escalation. Only it's NATO that's doing the escalating, not Russia. Unfortunately, the hostilities in Ukraine have not yet been stopped, but responsibility for this lies primarily with Europe. Europe constantly escalates the conflict. They have no other goals. If NATO had not come closer to Russia's borders, the conflict in Ukraine could have been avoided. If Trump had been in power, the conflict could have been avoided, Censor.net reports Russia's president as claiming. What this essentially amounts to is Putin telling Valdai attendees that Russia is only attacking NATO now because NATO didn't simply allow him to take control of Ukraine. As is so often the case, Putin is creating his own version of history to justify his actions. We only need to go back to his essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians to see examples of that. The entire essay is a Russia-favoring explanation of the supposed history between Russia and Ukraine that essentially amounts to Putin claiming that Ukraine isn't, and should never have been, a country. Perhaps that's what he's trying to claim at Valdai. In Putin's mind, Russia is trying to claim what should always have belonged to Russia. Never mind international treaties or Ukraine's independence, Russia has never fully acknowledged Ukraine's sovereignty, as Chatham House noted in August 2022. Russia at least acknowledged the existence of a border with Ukraine. However, only the land border was formally agreed upon in 2003, while the exact demarcation remained disputed. At the same time, the maritime boundaries in the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait were never fully resolved. Putin took advantage of this fact, treating it as an opening to declare the war that rages today in an escalation beyond what many expected just half a decade ago. And yet, according to Putin, NATO is at fault for escalating. NATO should have stayed away from Russia's borders, which roughly translates to NATO should never have come near Ukraine. Because it did, Putin seems to be saying, Russia has had no choice but to start launching secret attacks against Europe. Note the use of the word secret. A secret attack isn't a secret if the nation doing the attack admits to what it's doing. So as soon as Putin accused NATO of escalation, he rubbished any suggestion that Russia is somehow responsible for any sort of attacks on NATO nations. Is Russia planning to attack NATO? Putin asked. This nonsense is impossible to believe. We have never initiated military confrontations ourselves, but if someone wants to challenge Russia, let them try. I would say, calm down, sleep well, and finally deal with your own problems. Here we see a classic case of Putin attempting to sow the seeds of disunity in Europe, all while denying that he's doing the very thing that everybody in Europe can see him doing. That sort of denial is par for the course when it comes to Russia, and it's parroted by many of Putin's cronies. As European leaders sound the alarm about Russia's drones and other provocations in the Baltic region, Newsweek said on October 2nd, Russia is trying to act like nothing is happening. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has even flatly stated that this is war in response to what Russia is doing. Tusk says that the rest of Europe, along with Poland, needs to abandon any illusion that Russia isn't fighting against NATO as we speak. Putin's response to all of this is that Europe is lying about what Russia is doing. The drone incursions, he says, aren't happening, and Europe is only making these accusations to inflame tensions to boost the defense spending. Again, none of this is Russia's fault. That's the message that Putin wants to send, at least to the people inside his own country, who might buy into the narrative that he's trying to create. Russia, if it's attacking NATO at all, which it isn't, is only doing so because Europe is making Russia do it. Europe got too close to Ukraine. Europe started spending record-breaking amounts of money on militarization. It's everybody else's fault except Russia's. Speaking of Europe's militarization, that's another reason that Putin gave for attacking NATO, even if he claims that Russia isn't doing just that by sending drones and fighter jets into NATO airspace. We are closely watching Europe's accelerating militarization. Either it is just talk, or it's time for us to take appropriate measures, Putin said. This quote, perhaps more than any other we've shared so far, reveals what Putin is really up to with the attacks on NATO nations. Those attacks are stopping just short of causing serious damage precisely because Putin is trying to feed into his narrative of NATO, and particularly European NATO, as an aggressor against which Russia has no choice but to fight. It doesn't matter that Europe is only militarizing to the extent that it is because of Russia's Ukraine invasion and the many hybrid warfare tactics Putin has used in Europe for years. It also doesn't matter that Europe getting too close to Russia, such as with Finland's and Sweden's decisions to join NATO, is only happening because of Putin's Ukraine invasion. What matters is that Putin can craft a narrative for his own people that everything that Russia does is always in response to an escalation by the enemy. All NATO countries are fighting us, and they're no longer hiding it, Putin also said during his speech. He then went on to claim that NATO troops are actually taking part in combat operations by supplying Ukraine with intelligence and weapons. It's a strange combination of whining about how NATO wouldn't let Putin do what he wants in Ukraine and more words that feed into the twisted narrative that is NATO and not Russia that caused the situation Europe now finds itself in. Europe's militarization is one of the escalations that Putin rallies against. Putin causes the problems and then he positions himself as the man who can solve them. Finally, as a coda to his speech, Putin flung himself into blatant hypocrisy by trying to show some semblance of sympathy to a country that he has spent over 3.5 years attempting to conquer. It's painful for Russians to watch the suffering of Ukraine's people, said a president who has happily ordered shelling and strikes that have cost the lives of more than 14,116 Ukrainian civilians, in addition to untold thousands of Ukrainian soldiers. The Ukrainian tragedy is a pain for Ukrainians, for Russians, for all of us, Putin concluded. A pain that Putin created. That, in a nutshell, is the real reason why Putin is launching secret attacks against NATO right now. Ultimately, it's what he always wanted to do, to the point where the Ukraine invasion could even be argued as a stepping stone for a later escalation of the fighting Putin wants to start with European NATO. Everything Putin said in his speech is indicative of a man who purposefully ignores the laws of cause and effect, or worse, twists those laws to his own ends. Anybody outside of Russia knows that Putin's agenda to invade Ukraine prompted the escalation of the tensions between Russia and NATO. However, Putin will tell you that the escalation only started when NATO started helping a sovereign nation that Russia had no right to invade. Putin falsely casts Russia as the victim. And it's this fake narrative of victimhood that ultimately provides Putin with the flimsy justification on which he bases all of his attacks against NATO. So the reasons for Russia's attacks, as Putin claims them to be, are hidden behind a veil of falsehood and bravado. It's only by cutting through that veil that we start to unveil the real reasons that Putin doesn't mention, rather than the reasons he uses to create his narrative. There are two of these reasons. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has already revealed the first. On October 2nd, Euromaidan Press reported on Zelensky's appearance at the 7th European Political Community (EPC) summit in Copenhagen. There, Zelensky laid out the first of Russia's reasons for launching his secret attacks against NATO. "It's all about division," Zelensky claims. "We all now live in a new reality, and I believe everyone understands this, even those who are not yet willing to admit it," Ukraine's president said at the conference. That mention of those who aren't willing to admit what's happening is a subtle way of saying that there is still a level of disunity inside European NATO when it comes to how to handle what Russia is doing. We saw an example of this division following Russia's sending at least 19 drones into Polish airspace. Though most Western intel officials seem to believe the drones were indeed Russian, some were questioning whether Russia intended to send them as recently as September 19th. That's according to CNN, which says that the intelligence gathered up to that point on the drones was mixed and difficult to interpret. That's the point. Putin's secret attacks on NATO, no matter how blatant they appear on the surface, still offer Russia enough plausible deniability for it to claim that they were never intended. Europe should calm down, stop getting hysterical, and though Putin would never say it, NATO should get bogged down in arguing amongst itself about whether such attacks carry intent and, if so, what NATO should do about them. When confusion reigns, Russia gains opportunities to do whatever it wants in Ukraine and Europe. Zelensky used the EPC stage in Copenhagen to caution against this divided approach. Recent drone incidents across Europe are a clear signal that Russia remains confident enough to expand this war, and it was never only about Ukraine. Russia has always sought to break the West, especially Europe, Zelensky claimed. Estonia's Minister of Defense, Hanno Pevkur, agrees with Zelensky. Speaking to the Express on October 2nd, Pevkur stated, "Russia is deliberately pushing all of us, the NATO allies, to deal with our own matters that we have here. Some air incidents and airspace violations, and then we have drone incidents, and then we have cyber attacks, and then there are Moldovan elections." Putin's suggestion that European nations should calm down, sleep well, and finally deal with your own problems takes on a new light here. Russia's leader basically confirmed what Pevkur and Zelensky are saying. Russia is creating problems inside the territory of NATO members to force them to focus on those problems. In doing so, he takes attention away from what he's doing in Ukraine, and if everything works out as Putin hopes, can even create division within NATO as each nation affected by Russia's secret attacks tries to come up with its own way of dealing with them. After all, a country like Poland, which borders Ukraine and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, is going to be far more worried about drone incursions than a nation like France, which is far enough away to not have to be so concerned. That's the idea. Make one nation hysterical to cast it in a bad light to another nation that isn't so directly affected. Whether the approach is actually working or not isn't especially relevant. Putin is still using it, which gives us the real reason why he's launching secret attacks against NATO. The second reason is far more practical. Putin wants to test NATO. Pevkur lays out this second real reason clearly when speaking to the Express. Russia is testing how far they can go to destabilize society, Pevkur says. Is it okay to kill someone? Is it okay to disrupt the air traffic? Is it okay to disrupt the undersea cables? In other words, each of Russia's secret attacks against NATO is a test of how far Russia can push before it gets a real response. That doesn't mean NATO scrambling jets to escort Russian jets out of NATO airspace. That's been done before. Putin wants to figure out what he has to do to push a NATO nation so far that it strikes back. Why? Well, that would complete the narrative. Even one definitive attack on a Russian asset, regardless of whether that asset is in NATO airspace or not, would be all that Putin needs to send Russia's propaganda machine into overdrive. Again, this is something that Putin said without actually saying it during his speech. When he talks of Europe escalating and militarizing, what he's really saying is that he's using his secret attacks to prompt a not-so-secret attack that allows him to justify a much more direct response. Pevkur isn't the only one who thinks this is the case. Al Jazeera's Sarah Shamim posed the question of whether Russia was testing NATO with its drone incursions in a September 25th article. She noted that several European countries, including Poland, Estonia, Denmark, and Romania, have had to deal with Russia's secret attacks in September alone, and that the NATO response was to essentially threaten without following through. Charlie Edwards, who is the Senior Fellow for Strategy and National Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, adds to this. The recent incursions into NATO airspace suggest a calculated escalation, Edwards writes. Firstly, to identify potential vulnerabilities in NATO's air defenses, assess response times, and gauge the alliance's resolve. Secondly, to spread insecurity, sow disunity among allies, and erode public confidence in NATO's ability to protect its citizens. Thirdly, the drone incursions forced NATO to expend expensive missiles against low-cost drones that, if repeated at scale, would strain alliance inventories and budgets. Note the point about sowing disunity that we made earlier. Edwards also says that Russia may have been emboldened by America's seeming lack of interest in European security matters during the last months, giving Putin yet another reason to test his hand. NATO may just escort Russian aerial assets away, which shows Putin that NATO isn't ready for the fight Russia wants to start. Or a NATO nation goes on the attack, providing the propaganda fuel we've already discussed. Either way, Russia's leader comes out on top. His secret attacks achieve their real objectives. The question now is what NATO can do about all of this. One option is just to pierce the Russian veil by creating the united front that Putin has been trying to prevent. Zelensky made this point during his Copenhagen speech, claiming that all of those Putin targets should join the PURL initiative. This initiative not only supports us but also strengthens ties between Europe and the United States. The key is to remember that the root of the problem is Russia's war, Zelensky claimed. PURL is an initiative to enable partners to buy US systems used to protect Ukraine and Europe. It's all about unity, and Zelensky believes that investing heavily into that program will showcase how Europe is aware of what Putin is trying to pull and will fight against it via Ukraine. More direct fighting against Russia may also be required. Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andriy Sybiha, said that NATO needs to be wary of delivering weak responses to Putin in the wake of the Polish drone incursions. This situation shows that finally the decision needs to be taken to enable partner air defense capabilities in neighboring countries to be used to intercept drones and missiles in the Ukrainian airspace, including those approaching NATO borders, Sybiha wrote on X. Several in NATO support this approach, including Poland, as you'll discover if you check out our video covering Poland's warning to Russia. US President Donald Trump has also suggested that it may be time for NATO nations to start shooting Russia's jets and drones down, assuming they enter NATO territory. This direct approach carries the risk of playing right into Putin's attempts to spin a narrative, as we've already explained. However, it may also send a message that Russia's president doesn't want to hear. NATO isn't messing around anymore. If Russia is using secret attacks, NATO will thwart them publicly and then call out Putin with the evidence of what really happened. More sanctions are also an option if NATO wants to go down the indirect response route. The EU is already putting together its 19th sanctions package against Russia, which will place more economic pressure on Putin. The strategy here could be to continue supporting Ukraine, perhaps through the PURL initiative, while also draining Russia's war machine to the point where a direct response against Putin's aggression won't be needed at all. Zelensky supports this approach, especially when it comes to dealing with Russia's shadow fleet. Russia continues to use tankers despite sanctions. This must be stopped. Additional sanctions are needed against captains, crews, and owners of the shadow fleet companies, Ukraine's president said in Copenhagen. Yet more sanctions won't stop Russia's secret attacks, but they will limit Putin's ability to conduct them, especially if they're combined with more support for Ukraine. Finally, NATO, particularly its European members, may have no other option but to prepare for a future war. Creating a drone wall that covers NATO's eastern flank is one of the ways to do that, and it's an idea that Euronews says has achieved broad support from several EU leaders. This approach would see NATO take on a defensive posture, forcing Putin to get bolder with his secret attacks, as they would need to break through a barrier before they reached NATO territory. Could this be a way to play Putin at his own game? To force Putin into making an actual and very public attack to start the war that he wants? We can only wait and see what the drone wall ends up being, assuming it's approved.
Russia was doomed to lose the Ukraine war from the very start. Vladimir Putin may not have seen it. Perhaps he still doesn't. And one could argue that the West never saw it coming either. However, Ukraine always had an underlying advantage, which is only now fully coming to the fore, that it has held against Russia for well over 3 years in a war that was meant to be over in days. This is why Putin won't win in Ukraine. And it all comes down to something that Ukraine is doing that Russia has failed to do: achieve technological superiority. That's according to Paul Warburg, who laid out his argument in a YouTube video on October 1st, noting that Ukraine's technological advantage isn't just a product of its association with the West. It comes down to key differences in everything about Ukraine and Russia, from the way the two countries govern their societies to the strategies they employ on the battlefield.
Really what we are seeing at this point in the war in Ukraine is Russia is getting inherently weaker with each passing day, while Ukraine is getting increasingly stronger with each passing day, especially from a technological standpoint.
This is something that's been happening throughout the entire war, Warburg adds. But now, the pace of Ukraine's technological advances has reached such a point that Russia has no hope of keeping up. One only needs to look at some of the most recent examples of weapons Ukraine has come up with to see that. Take the Flamingo, for instance. At a cursory glance, this weapon may not seem all that different from the cruise missiles that Russia has been using against Ukraine since Putin launched his invasion. However, it is different in several ways. For a start, it's a drone cruise missile hybrid, with modern diplomacy adding that it also has elements of a penetrator bomb built into it. Nothing like that's been really built before, as Ukraine has developed a new subcategory of a weapon that leans into everything it's learned about drone warfare during the war with Russia. In essence, the Flamingo is the result of years of tweaking and testing, of Ukraine allowing its most innovative people to cook so they can come up with things that might not even be dreamed of in Russian society. A weapon that acts like a drone and a missile at once and can reach 3,000 kilometers, which is about 1,860 miles deep into Russia, while carrying a warhead that weighs over a ton. The video will return to why Russia could never create something like this later. But first, take a look at some other Ukrainian innovations. The Flamingo is an example of Ukraine coming up with a new weapon to serve a purpose. The country's been conducting long-range drone strikes on Russian territory for a long time. It also had long-range missiles provided by the West, though it often faces restrictions on how and when it can use them. The US has only in September started to allow Ukraine to attack Russian targets with American-made missiles, after having quietly blocked the country from doing so for months. The Flamingo is a solution to that sort of problem. If Ukraine builds it at home, nobody can stop Ukraine from using it. This is an example of Ukraine adapting to what's in front of it, and the same approach is seen with its development of interceptor drones. These drones, which can cost as little as $1,000 per unit, are designed for the sole purpose of stopping Russia's long-range drone hordes in their tracks. And Ukraine is using them. This technology is battle-tested already, to the point where Ukraine's partners are willing to invest in it. In September, the UK committed to a plan that will allow Ukraine to build these interceptor drones in massive numbers. Dubbed Project Octopus, the plan should allow Ukraine to produce thousands of interceptors every month, giving it a massive stockpile of drones that have already proven themselves effective against the Shahed types that Russia launches at Ukraine. The Kyiv Independent adds that Ukraine eventually wants to get to a point where it can deploy 1,000 of its interceptors every day to stop Russia's drones in their tracks. Again, Ukraine saw a problem. Then it solved it. Ukraine has also spearheaded the development of drones that use artificial intelligence or AI to great effect. This time, Ukraine is looking to solve the manpower disparity between itself and Russia. One of the most recent examples of Ukraine leaning into AI comes from the guided AI attack drone swarms the country has introduced onto the battlefield. On September 2nd, United 24 Media said that Ukraine has become the first military in history to conduct battlefield operations using swarms of drones controlled by AI. Those drones don't need human operators. They don't need Ukraine soldiers to put themselves at risk. Rather, they can almost serve as replacements for soldiers, being capable of hunting down and destroying Russian infantry and armor with very limited human oversight. Russia's plan all along has been to overwhelm Ukraine with its manpower advantage. With AI drones, Ukraine turns the tables and once again innovates with a focus on solving a problem. These three examples of Ukraine's innovation are impressive, even if they're not breakthroughs in the way that the first intercontinental ballistic missile, for instance, might have been. However, it's not just the technology itself that delivers superiority to Ukraine, it's how that technology is used, as Warburg explained. Weapons like the Flamingo and Ukraine's interceptor drones might not seem very innovative from a technological standpoint, Warburg notes,
but are very innovative from a warfare standpoint in how they are being used to address the actual situation on the battlefield.
Contrast this with what Warburg notes that Russia is doing on the innovation front.
At the same time, Russia seems to not really be innovating all that much. They are, in some cases, matching the innovations that Ukraine is bringing, especially where it's easy to match those innovations. But for the most part, Russia is not really bringing a whole lot of new stuff to bear on the battlefield.
And he has a point. Perhaps the most important of Russia's innovations so far has been its glide bombs, which allow Russia to convert Soviet-era dumb bombs into semi-guided munitions. But beyond that, Russia hasn't innovated a whole lot. It's just copied Ukraine's homework, assuming that the homework was easy to copy. This shows a fundamental difference in how Ukraine and Russia go about waging this war. For Russia, reliance on what it already has seems to be more important than innovating. As for Ukraine, adaptation is key. Every time a new problem arises, Ukraine's technological superiority allows it to confront that problem and come up with a solution for it. However, it goes deeper than a difference in military approaches. The real reason that Russia was doomed to lose the Ukraine war from day one is that its very society is structured in such a way to make it impossible for Russia to ever hold the technological edge over Ukraine. What it really boils down to, Warburg says, is the battle between democracy and dictatorship. As history has shown several times already, the former overcomes the latter on the technological front for a simple reason. Warburg points out,
or governments that are more inclusive of average people in society, even if they are not full democracies, are inherently superior to governments that are less inclusive, that are more centralized, and where there are less opportunities for average people.
His point is that a free society fosters innovation because the people within that society are rewarded for innovating. Contrast that to a centralized society where innovation can only happen if it's prompted by an order from up high, and it becomes clear why Ukraine is pulling ahead. Its innovators build to solve problems, and they're rewarded for doing so. But in Russia, anybody who might have an innovative bone in their body is given every reason not to come up with new ideas. Back to the interceptor drone example. Ukraine created this drone because it has a problem with Russia's long-range drone attacks. These attacks have become more frequent and more intense throughout 2025, leading to many occasions where Russia has bombarded Ukraine with hundreds of Shahed-type drones in an effort to overwhelm air defenses. September was a standout month for this tactic on the Russian side. ABC News says that Russia launched 5,636 drones at Ukraine in September. That represented a 39% increase on the number of Russian drones launched the previous month, though it was still a little short of the record-breaking 6,443 drones Russia launched in July 2025. Still, the problem is clear. Russia is launching thousands of drones per month, and Ukraine needs to deal with them. Now, interceptor drones don't offer a massively high-tech way of dealing with this problem. They're cheap and easy for Ukraine to make. That affordability is what makes them such a standout technology. A small drone costing $1,000 or so can be loaded with an inexpensive warhead to be flown into a Shahed-type drone that may have cost Russia anywhere between 20 and 70 times that amount to build. Interestingly, Ukraine is solving a secondary problem with these drones. Directly, interceptors help Ukraine to tackle Russia's Shahed-type drone hordes. Indirectly, the cost difference between interceptors and Shaheds is so vast that they also allow Ukraine to drain Russia's financial resources by forcing it to launch more failed strikes. As Warburg points out,
and this is basically allowing Ukraine to defeat Russia in a war of attrition, where it is going to be too expensive for Russia to defeat Ukraine over the long term because it is more affordable for Ukraine to defend itself.
There is plenty to build on with this point, though much of it doesn't relate to Ukraine's technological superiority. To learn more about the impact that attrition is having on Russia, check out our video where we cover the topic, along with how even Kremlin propaganda is starting to turn against Putin. The key point here is that it's Ukraine's adaptability that it's allowing it to turn the war of attrition that Russia started on its head. Warburg makes that point, as already discussed. Mick Ryan, writing for Futura Doctrina, reinforces it in an article where he claims that Ukraine has changed the entire character of war through its malleability. The tentacles of technological insertions reach even further than drones. They've enabled the meshing of artificial intelligence, civil and military sensor networks, and the democratization of battlefield information. Ryan writes, AI systems can help drones pick and confirm targets by combing through open source sensors and intelligence analyses, and then combining this information with military intelligence. Again, this shows a link to democracy versus dictatorship in information sharing, as well as the military approach. Ukraine actively encourages anybody and everybody to share information via whatever channels they have available to them to help the war effort. Russia, on the other hand, represses. It does things like shutting down internet access in regions subjected to Ukraine's long-range drone strikes because it wants as little information as possible coming out. How is the average Russian even supposed to conceive of a solution to the challenges Russia faces against Ukraine when they're not even allowed to see what those challenges are? Information then is as critical to Ukraine as creating an environment in which its innovators can do what they do best. And it's perhaps the lack of information being shared with people who might be able to help that's causing Russia so many problems on the technological front. Russia lags behind Ukraine at every technological turn. Warburg thinks back to the very beginning of the war, when Ukraine first started using drones to tackle Russia's armor.
When Ukraine first introduced drones to the battlefield, Russia's response was to mock them, make fun of them, and to continue sending large waves of tanks, infantry, and armored vehicles.
It's now clear how that turned out for Russia. Over 1 million casualties, more than 11,200 destroyed tanks, and almost 23,300 lost armored vehicles later, and Russia now knows that it can't bring massive armored assaults to a drone fight. Russia copied, of course. Once it saw that Ukraine was successful with the strategy it previously mocked, Russia started doing what Ukraine was doing. But by that point, Russia was already behind, and the gap in technology has only been getting wider ever since. That fact is what many tend to miss, Warburg notes. It's relatively easy to see how Ukraine innovates and Russia copies. But what's often missed is that the technological wedges between Ukraine and Russia grow with every one of these innovation into copying cycles, Warburg claims.
And we're now reaching a point where Ukraine's advantages over Russia could become catastrophic.
Ukraine's interceptor drones are one such wedge. They already have these drones, and they're combat proven, and as mentioned earlier, being moved into mass production with the help of Ukraine's allies. As always, Russia has tried to copy. However, it's so far behind that whatever interceptors it's making are still in the testing stages. As Forbes said on September 9, the only Russian interceptor drones that have been seen are models paraded around or displayed at exhibitions. None of these drones have been deployed yet, and it may be several months before they are. This massive wedge provides Ukraine with opportunities, especially with long-range drone strikes. Ukraine's strategy for the last few months has been to target Russia's oil refineries with repeated attacks, rather than isolated strikes. The strategy is working. Around 40% of Russia's refining capacity has been taken offline by drones that Russia might have been able to stop with interceptors. But Russia isn't there yet, and that means Ukraine likely has a few more months in which it can devastate Russian infrastructure, perhaps to the point of no return, while Russia tries to come up with its own version of something that Ukraine is already using. Russia has been here before. Warburg brings up the Cold War between the US and Russia, and how it was America's ability to innovate that ultimately led to its winning. A perfect example comes from the author of Chip War, Chris Miller, reports Taiwanese outlet Commonwealth magazine. The outlet draws on Miller's work to highlight the example of Texas Instruments coming up with integrated circuit technology that made pocket calculators possible. Naturally, the US military saw the potential for other uses, and it engaged Texas Instruments to create integrated circuit technology to help it develop the Minuteman II intercontinental ballistic missile that gave the US the ability to hit Russia with a nuke launch from American territory. Russia eventually came up with its own missiles. Later, as always. But what's seen with this Cold War example, as is also the case in the Ukraine war, is Warburg's point about democracies overcoming dictatorships in action. Texas Instruments didn't create integrated circuit technology because somebody told them to. They just did it because a new technology brings with it the chance for great rewards. While many of Ukraine's innovations are focused on war right now, the same philosophy is in place. Ukraine's innovators aren't told what to build, they're simply allowed to build, and they're rewarded when they come up with something that can benefit Ukraine in its current situation. If Ukraine weren't at war, these same innovators would be coming up with other sorts of products, and they'd be getting their rewards because they live in a society that allows them to register intellectual property and experience the fruits of their labor. Russia doesn't offer these opportunities to its people. The Soviets had to steal US technology to try to keep up with the US during the Cold War. They managed to steal it, but it almost always failed to make copies of American innovations that lived up to the originals, Warburg notes. The exact same thing is happening in the Ukraine war right now. The new weapons Russia builds are just a poor man's version of what Ukraine has innovated. Even the drones with which Russia assaults Ukraine aren't a Russian innovation. They're copies of Iran's Shahed drones. And what few tweaks Russia makes to the original Iranian design can't even come close to comparing to Ukraine's drone cruise missile hybrid Flamingo weapon. Russia is limited in how it innovates, and it has been for decades. The reason comes back to Russia's centralized form of government, as highlighted earlier. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, dug deeper into Russia's issues in a September 2021 piece, in which it highlighted 3 structural constraints of Russian society that hamper innovation. Russia's preference for domestic supply chains means it can't draw from as many markets as innovation leaders. There's also been a decline in educational standards, particularly when it comes to the sciences, CSIS claims. And of course, sanctions, even back in 2021, limited Russia's access to international technologies that it might be able to use to innovate. Warburg highlights another issue: oligarchs, or, as Warburg dubs them, the inconceivably wealthy people in Russia who act like a mafia within the country. Nothing gets done in Russia without the oligarchs taking their slice, almost as though they're running a mafia-esque extortion racket that exists to take away the fruits of labor that Ukraine's and America's great minds enjoyed as a result of their inventions. As Warburg says,
for your average Russian person, it's not that there's zero innovation in Russia, but for your average Russian person, there is not as much incentive to innovate because a lot of people fear that if they're successful, that could be the worst possible thing for them.
That's a symptom of living in both a dictatorship and an oligarchy, where the rich and powerful will always come calling for a far bigger slice of whatever somebody comes up with than will end up being given to the actual innovator. Imagine living in a city run by the mafia, Warburg asks. Would someone rather have a basic job that keeps them out of the mafia's spotlight? Or would they prefer to run a business that becomes successful enough to cause the mafia to come calling, offering protection in exchange for a cut? That's what Russia's potential innovators face. Can they be blamed for choosing the nondescript job even when they have what it takes to come up with interesting new technologies? Ukraine's societal advantage, and what is going to win it the war that Russia never actually had a chance of winning, is that it goes in the opposite direction. Ukraine's win-win 2030 strategy for global impact is the perfect example. Under this scheme, Ukraine offers its innovators everything they need to come up with new ideas. The country's entrepreneurs get access to global markets, along with research and development infrastructure. Ukraine aids them in protecting and commercializing their intellectual property, meaning those taking part in the program actually receive the money they deserve for coming up with great ideas in the first place. Yes, this is a state-created program, but the products that come out of this program won't be owned by the state, and that's the difference. An equivalent Russian program would inevitably require the intellectual property of anything useful that came out of it to be handed over to the Russian state, likely with minimal recompense for the person who invented the product. Putin won't win in Ukraine because Russia's very society makes it impossible for the country to achieve technological superiority. Against other nations, that may not have been a problem, but in Ukraine, Russia is dealing with an opponent that adapts to what it sees and gives it great minds the space, time and incentives they need to create what needs to be created to deal with the enemy. Remember, Ukraine doesn't need to obliterate Russia to win. It just has to use its technological advantage to attrit Russia to the point where it can no longer fight. The tide of the Russian-Ukraine war is turning, and not just along the front lines, but deep within Russia itself, where dissent is growing among Russian generals, officials, and nationalist figures. These are the kinds of people who were once among President Vladimir Putin's biggest cheerleaders. Now, as the Kremlin continues to push blindly and stubbornly onward with its increasingly wasteful and unsustainable invasion, refusing to admit its failures or adapt its tactics, those same people are starting to call out their country's leadership. In a country like Russia, where dissenting voices are often immediately silenced and many members of the public feel frightened to say anything that goes against the government, this is a big story. It's a sign that after more than 3 years of war and all the terrible losses and chaos it's caused, even Putin's biggest supporters are starting to lose faith. And the bigger this wave of dissent becomes, the more difficult it will be for the Kremlin to overcome. Now, one of the key figures spearheading the recent surge of resentment and frustration towards the Kremlin is Igor Girkin, also known under the alias Igor Ivanovich Strelkov, with Strelkov translating to shooter or gunman in English. A former Russian army veteran and former Federal Security Service (FSB) officer, Girkin played a massive role in Russia's annexation of Crimea back in 2014. He was also one of the key figures in exacerbating the Donbass war, and even referring to himself as the one who pulled the trigger of this war after leading an armed group of Russian militants into the city of Sloviansk in the Donetsk region of Ukraine. Gherkin is an ultra-nationalist who's dedicated his entire life to his country, and when Russian forces invaded Ukraine in 2022, he was one of the biggest pro-war voices in the country. He gained attention across the nation as a military blogger, using platforms like Telegram to share his views on the invasion. However, despite wanting to see Russia succeed and capture territories like Donetsk and Luhansk, Gherkin soon became critical of how the Kremlin was going about its campaign. In fact, in April 2022, only a matter of weeks into the invasion, Gherkin stated that Russia needed a general mobilization to have any chance of truly winning its war. Soon after, he stated, "Without at least a partial mobilization in the Russian Federation, it will be impossible and highly dangerous to launch a deep strategic offensive against the so-called Ukraine." By September of 2022, Gherkin's tone had shifted from pessimistic to utterly defeatist. He predicted a complete defeat for Russia, telling his hundreds of thousands of fans and followers, "We've already lost. The rest is just a matter of time." As time went by, Gherkin continued to criticize Russia's military decisions, focusing most of his attacks on those at the very top of the food chain, like the former Russian defense minister Sergei Shoigu, who Gherkin said should be executed by firing squad, and even Putin himself. He even formed a group with other disgruntled nationalists, like Maxim Kalishnikov, called the Club of Angry Patriots. Gherkin was allowed to get away with these kinds of criticisms for some time, since he had a large and loyal nationalist fan base, and the Kremlin was reportedly worried about the consequences of arresting or punishing such a popular figure. But in the end, Russia's leadership decided that enough was enough. On July 21, 2023, Gherkin was arrested by the authorities on charges of extremism, not long after calling out Putin as a cowardly waste of space and urging him to resign the presidency. He was convicted in 2024 and has been behind bars ever since. But he certainly hasn't stayed silent. He continued to write letters and make statements about how he feels the war is going, and his criticisms of Russia's leadership have persisted. In one of his most recent statements, Gherkin asks the question, "If we can't win the war, should we abandon it?" He goes on to highlight the extremely serious and constantly deteriorating conditions of the conflict, saying, "Unfortunately, I don't see any prospect of a quick victory over Ukraine, or even if that will ever happen. Someone will have to be held accountable for the reckless plans completely disconnected from the real operational situation, which have led to serious defeats, setbacks, and enormous losses." There's a lot of evidence to back up Gherkin's viewpoint. The statistics show, for example, that Russia has suffered well over 1 million casualties at this point, and the number is growing on a daily basis. All along the front lines, the Kremlin's commanders continue to throw men into the meat grinder, treating troops as nothing more than replaceable, disposable cannon fodder. Its forces are making only the most marginal gains in many areas, sacrificing dozens, if not hundreds of lives for the smallest slivers of land. A Russian soldier named Alexander Zaborovsky recently summed up the situation in a Telegram post, describing the recklessness of those in positions of power and the futility of their frontline efforts. Zaborovsky talks about Russian soldiers having to march over a carpet of corpses, dozens of miles from supply depots, low on food, without adequate vehicles to get to where they need to be. He claims that the current mobilization will be wiped out by these daring commanders in a couple of months, and that's it, tops, before going on to argue that if Russia cannot control the skies and stop Ukrainian drones, then Russian bodies will simply continue to pile up on the ground. While few are bold enough to openly admit this, there must be countless other Russian soldiers who agree wholeheartedly with Zaborovsky's statements. Numerous reports have revealed how grim life is for the soldiers along the front lines on both sides of the divide, and the Russians in particular are so often thrown into the firing lines without adequate support, armor, or even military training. They are little more than sacrifices for the Kremlin's war machine, thrown away like pawns on a chessboard by commanders who appear to base their entire strategy on nothing more than brute force. It's no secret that Russia has a much larger military force than Ukraine, and it's evidently hoped that its numerical advantage would be enough to secure a quick and decisive victory. That didn't happen, but the Kremlin still throws soldiers at Ukraine in vast quantities, while recruiting tens of thousands more each month to replace those that are killed or injured along the front. So much of this strategy is based on numerical superiority, not tactical superiority, and it's clearly not enough to win this war, as Russia is losing troops at a staggering rate while stalling or even being pushed back in key frontline areas like the Pokros sector of Donetsk. On top of that, Russia is suffering in countless other ways. It lost staggering amounts of equipment, including over 4,100 tanks and more than 8,300 armored and infantry fighting vehicles, plus countless other pieces of valuable military hardware from bombers to radar stations. It also has to contend with the consequences of increasingly regular and destructive deep strike drone attacks on its infrastructure, including a spate of recent strikes targeting oil refineries, pipelines, and other energy facilities that have triggered a major fuel crisis, with people across the country lining up for hours and paying a small fortune just for a tank of gas. The Russian economy is rapidly weakening too, and when conditions getting so bad at such a rapid rate, with no signs of improvement on the horizon, it's little surprise that critics like Gherkin are calling the Kremlin out. This was pointed out by British historian, lecturer and writer, as well as Russia expert Mark Galeotti in a recent interview on the Times radio podcast. Galeotti notes that much of Gherkin's anger is directed at Russia's high command, including figures like former Defense Minister Shoigu, Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov, and Putin himself, stating,
"But the main thing is precisely his sense that time and time again, very poor decisions are made at the very top of the system. He's not really criticising the fighting generals at the front line. He's criticising the high command back in Moscow. And precisely his view is that they never ever acknowledge the mistakes they made. Everything is a grand triumph, or else it was an unavoidable mishap. There's never any awareness of that. And that's what he's really getting at. And that is a dangerous line for the Kremlin because it fits in with the perspectives of a lot of others, including those generals at the front line, who are trying their best to sort of tactically innovate.
If Gherkin was just one man yelling into the void, his criticisms might not mean all that much. But he's not the only one who feels this way. As Galeotti notes, numerous people are listening to Gherkin and nodding along with what he's saying. Putin, of course, isn't one of those in agreement, nor is Gerasimov or any of the other major figures in the Kremlin who will continue to blindly do Putin's bidding, no matter how wasteful or disastrous it ends up being. But across Russia and at the front lines of Ukraine, there are generals, officers, soldiers, nationalists, and just everyday Russians who, as Galeotti puts it,
the people who are just fed up with the way this war is being fought. They didn't have a problem with invading Ukraine. They had a problem with the fact that it's being done so damn badly. And the striking thing is that, his social media presence is not only still there, it gets retweeted and reposted and discussed a lot. And, phrases and expressions of his do crop up in other people's work. So, he clearly is influential. As I said, I think we need to stress that he's speaking for a narrow constituency, but it's a constituency, to put it bluntly, with guns.
In other words, Gherkin's words are being heard, agreed with, and repeated among powerful people. People like Russian generals who are simply sick and tired of waging a war that's going nowhere and following orders that fail to get results. It's easy to understand their frustration. On the face of it, Ukraine versus Russia is like a lightweight boxer going up against a heavyweight champion. Russia not only has much more manpower, but far greater numbers of critical military equipment, including tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, missiles, and more. It's mastered the art of drone warfare in recent years too, regularly firing hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles at Kyiv and other cities and towns far and wide across Ukraine. It should have been able to win this war if it approached it correctly, with the appropriate levels of strategic thinking and preparation. Instead, more than 3.5 years since Russian troops first crossed the border, astonishingly little progress has been made on the whole, and the Kremlin actually controls less territory in Ukraine today than it did in March 2022. Despite all of Putin's bold claims and grand proclamations, he's not getting any closer to ruling over Ukraine anytime soon, and his country has paid and continues to pay an extortionate price in his ruthless and reckless pursuit of power. US President Donald Trump summed up the situation well in a recent Truth Social post, in which he boldly stated Ukraine could go on to turn the tide of the war and recapture all of its lost land from Russia. Trump also wrote, Russia has been fighting aimlessly for 3.5 years, a war that should have taken a real military power less than a week to win. This is not distinguishing Russia. In fact, it's very much making them look like a paper tiger. When the people living in Moscow and all of the great cities, towns and districts all throughout Russia find out what's really going on with this war, the fact that it's almost impossible for them to get gasoline through the long lines that are being formed, and all of the other things that are taking place in their war economy, where most of their money is being spent on fighting Ukraine, which has great spirit and only getting better, Ukraine will be able to take back their country in its original form. And who knows, maybe even go further than that. Putin and Russia are in big economic trouble, and this is the time for Ukraine to act. This is not the kind of situation Putin and his fellow Kremlin cronies likely had in mind back in early 2022. They couldn't have foreseen such a grim fate awaiting their military and their economy a few years later, but it's something that critics like Gherkin have been pointing out for years. And now, it appears more and more people are starting to ask the questions that matter. Questions like, what's the point of this war continuing when there's no clear end in sight, and no obvious plan or path to victory? Why has the Kremlin not changed its tactics to counteract its enormous losses of men and equipment? And how has Ukraine been allowed to continuously and effectively strike at such valuable and important pieces of energy infrastructure all across Russian territory? Ultimately, the answer to all of those questions boils down to more or less the same thing: bad leadership. Those at the top have failed to make the right decisions at the right times. They've demonstrated stubbornness, incompetence, and a flagrant inability to adapt to the changing conditions of this war. And they've treated their people, their soldiers, and their economy with total disregard. They've got away with it for quite a while too, but it appears that the mood in Russia is starting to shift. At least in certain circles and communities where opinions are becoming more aligned with those of people like Igor Gherkin rather than Vladimir Putin. Here's what this might mean moving forward. Despite what many outside Russia hope, it's unlikely that this growing resentment and dissent will lead to any actual coup, revolt, or major attempt to topple the Putin regime. Putin has a firm grasp on his position of power and goes to great lengths to secure and cement that position. In recent months, for example, he's been strengthening ties with the FSB, the modern-day equivalent of the Soviet-era KGB, to initiate a sort of purge, removing officials, generals, and other key figures of authority who might pose some sort of threat to Putin, either now or in the future. Dozens of high-ranking figures have either been demoted, forced to resign, or arrested in some cases on alleged charges of corruption, with some even pushed to suicide or quite possibly killed at the hands of the Kremlin, like the former Minister of Transport, Roman Starovoyt, who allegedly took his own life after being relieved of his duties by Putin in July of this year. Even when there was a big rebellion against the Kremlin in 2023, when the Russian mercenary leader and former Putin ally Yevgeny Prigozhin led an uprising against the government and marched towards Moscow, Putin took decisive action. The rebellion ended almost as swiftly as it began, and Prigozhin mysteriously died in a plane crash just weeks later. Thus, even if generals are unhappy right now, it's unlikely that any of them will follow Prigozhin's example and lead some sort of charge against the Kremlin. However, as Galeotti puts it, if and when any sort of uprising or rebellion does occur, it's likely that even if these angry, frustrated generals won't be the ones leading it, they also won't do much or anything to stop it.
These are not people who are about to, turn their guns on Moscow. But as we saw with the Prigozhin mutiny, when actually the overwhelming majority of the security forces neither joined the mutiny nor did they do anything to try and stop it, but essentially decided they'd just sit back and see what happens. I think what the views of people like Strelkov, why they're worth listening to, are precisely because these are the kind of people who, even if they're not going to be in a position to try and sort of topple Putin or change policy, they are getting sufficiently fed up that if and as and when there is some kind of black swan crisis, systemic crisis that really challenges the regime, they may well not be willing to come out and help it.
In other words, if Putin is ever truly under threat, which seems increasingly likely the longer the war goes on, many of his generals may not be too willing to step up and defend him. So, with fewer and fewer allies to call on, Putin's sphere of power and influence is actually diminishing, not expanding, and it's no one's fault but his own. Incapable of admitting to any sort of failure, unwilling to adapt, and indecisive in the moments that matter most, Russia's leader, who has so desperately tried to position himself as some sort of modern-day Peter the Great, appears increasingly isolated and weak. Now, learn more about Putin's mounting pile of problems in our recent video, looking at how the US is about to begin sharing invaluable intelligence with Ukraine, making Kyiv's deep strikes on Russia's energy infrastructure more effective and deadly than ever before. Or watch this video to see how Putin has been forced to go begging to Belarus for help in fixing his country's chaotic fuel crisis. And finally, make sure to subscribe to our channel too, so you can stay informed and up to date on everything that's going on in Ukraine, as well as news about other major conflicts around the world.